how to, in very simple language, I'm going to say how to get rid of barriers to learning. So thank you so much, Santa. I'm very glad it's navigating. So, ladies and gentlemen, what we'll do is we'll do it the way I read stories to my grandchildren. Every time we need to turn a page, I'll say, ding, and Chantal will navigate from, and we'll do a distance navigation. So can you just move this off screen, this comment, please, Chantal? So when we talk about barriers to learning this afternoon, we're not talking about institutional, we're not talking about institutional barriers to learning. So the lack of clear policy strategies, knowledge, skills, inclusive design, we're not going to talk about that. We are also not going to talk about physical barriers in terms of the technical stuff, like steps and narrow entrances and slippery floors, and natural environments like paths, and long distance that people with disability battle with, and that creates barriers to learning. We're also not going to talk about that. Ding. We are also not going to talk about social barriers, prejudice, shame, pity, isolation, and overprotection. Bing. And lastly, we're also not going to talk about communication barriers, the lack of braille, signpost, and interpreter. So what are we going to talk about? We are going to talk about you and your experience on a daily basis in the classroom, where I think if you remember pre-COVID days, we had mainstream schools, and here and there we had remedial classes, we had remedial schools, and we had schools for children with special needs. And even then, there were lots of learners who really battled, who experienced barriers to learning. And I don't know, I chose this picture specifically because I wonder if you also feel like this very often at the end of a day, where you feel, nearly defeated by the challenge level in your classroom, because it seems like there are just so many different barriers to learning, and where we had some children with barriers in a classroom, it seems that the exception is when there's a child without a barrier to learning. So it saps energy, it impacts on your health. And that's why this afternoon we quickly need to talk a little bit about barriers. What are they? Where did they come from? Which therapists need to help with what? And then what really happens in the brain? Because if we, it's like the cell phone and toaster, if we don't understand how it works, we can't operate it. So we're quickly going to look at the brain a little bit to understand why is it so difficult for children to learn. And then most importantly, towards the end of the afternoon, we're going to look at practical tips that you can do in class. And that is generally aimed at groups of children and not individuals. Of course, you can do it individually. Ding. So the first thing we need to realize when we really feel challenged in our classrooms, remember that no two minds are alike. No two children, even if they are twins, no two children have the exact same brain. As a matter of fact, they say if it was possible to open the brain, we would see that every person's brain differs as much as our fingerprints differ from each other. So what makes up a mind? Well, there's part of our genetic makeup, what we inherited, or what the learners inherited from their moms and their dads. It's also, there's a second thing, and that's the environment. And that includes nutrition while mom was pregnant. It refers to the birth, the first 1,000 days, and how things happen there, because that's the period when the brain is the most sensitive to environmental influences. So at number one, it is about our genes that we inherited from mom and dad. Then it's what happened with those genes within the environment when they were little, because you must remember, the child that you are teaching is not a blank slate. that child comes with a history. And that history, the third thing that makes up that history and that creates the diversity of minds in our classroom is the kinds of interpretations, the meaning that children give to experiences. You know, it may have happened where you and your siblings, your own siblings, sit around a table and you have a wonderful conversation, and then you recall a specific incident that happened in your family. And when you start discussing, and now I'm talking about same gene pool, same environmental influences, but when you talk about something that happened long, long ago as adults with your siblings, you may also hear that everybody interpreted that experience differently. So the three things that make up our minds, our genetic pool, it's our environmental influences, the stimulation we got, the nourishment we received very early in life, and how much stimulation, the interaction with adults, the interaction with other people, good language role models, and then finally, what does a child do with that information in their minds? And then, bing, so the diversity in minds create a lot of challenges or barriers to learning in class, but so does the diversity in development. Now, imagine your classroom is not at the flag yet. We're aiming for the flag. But you, that last circle, your lesson, the lesson that you're about to present, is that last circle before you get to the flag. But the learners who sit in front of you are not all with you. You know, some learners, if you look at the right bottom of the screen, there's a circle that's not even on the screen yet. And developmentally, if a child really, really had a tough time when mom was pregnant, when in the first 1,000 days, there was um, maybe there were social economical situations that contributed to difficult with healthy food and health and good health care and great stimulation and wonderful language role models. That child's background would put them somewhere on one of these circles, but it's not exactly on the circle where you expect them to be. If just one or two of the learners were not on that last circle before we hit the flag, it would be easy to teach. But due to automatic progression, what happens, many learners who were not ready for the next grade were progressed, and developmentally, they were not completely ready. So this diversity, these two slides, the previous one with the diversity of mind and the diversity in development, is just a bit of history. Why you are so tired at the end of the day. Why do you feel so frustrated? And your blood pressure may even rise at times because your stress levels are high, because it's not easy to teach such vast diversity, and especially if there's not 6 learners in a class, but we have a classroom full of learners. Bing. So when we look at learners and the typical barriers that we meet in class on a daily basis, for example, that would be ADD. What does that mean? That means there's a problem with attention. Now, if there's a problem with attention, it means the information actually can't get to the brain because you need to focus on something specifically to get it clearly in the brain. Imagine if you took a photo and you were constantly moving your camera around, and you're not taking a video, you're taking a photo, all you'll get is a blur. But that's what happens with attention deficit. If a child daydreams in class a lot and their attention is not with you, the chances that they're absorbing, engaging, and absorbing the information sufficiently to be able to learn is compromised. Ding. But so is ADHD. So that means attention deficit hyperactive disorder. In other words, they battle with concentration. But not only do they battle with concentration, they also battle with impulse control because they find it extremely difficult to control their physical body. Those are the children, when you ask them a question, you see, please don't shout out, put up your hand. For the life of them, even if they try, they can't keep quiet. When that hand is up, the words are out already because they've got fundamental hiccup controlling their muscle movements. And you must remember the only way we can assess a child is through their muscle movements. When we assess, they have to say something, they have to do something, they have to write it, they have to read it, they have to demonstrate it. It's all muscle movements. So if a child has a problem controlling their muscles, it would be very difficult for such a child to concentrate in class and benefit. And therefore, ADD and ADHD pose tremendous barriers to learning. In low muscle tone. So when the learner suffers from low muscle tone, they battle to sit up. And you must always remember that the brain always pays attention to the needs of the physical body before it pays attention to the needs of your thoughts. So when the physical body is not working or functioning optimally, the brain will always send most of its attention and concentration to maintain the physical body. And then whatever attention and concentration is left will be used for emotional well-being, social development, and thinking in a classroom. So how do you recognize low muscle tone in a classroom? It's that child that can't sit up. They constantly slouching or lying down. They even write while lying down, or they prop their head up with a hand because their core muscles, the neck and core, which is the stomach and back muscles, are so weak that they can't keep their physical body upright. You see, when this happens, most of this child's concentration and attention, it's not their choice, it happens spontaneously. That's the way the brain works. We're going to talk about the brain a lot this afternoon because when that brain senses that the child is battling to sit upright, the brain will send all its energy, as much as it possibly can, to help that child to sit up. And if they can't, they will lie down. But when they lie down, their eyes are not in the optimal position to read or to write. Their ears are not in the optimal position to listen, and their hands are definitely not in the optimal position to write or demonstrate something. So it will create a barrier to learning. Ting! Poor listening skills, obviously. If a child or a learner is battling, or it seems like they lack fundamental listening skills, or they may appear that they have a problem with auditory processing, but it may be that there's actually a hiccup in terms of their hearing, and we need to talk about it a little bit. And what are we going to do about it is actually the most important thing. But with poor listening skills, it is difficult for the child to follow instructions. That's typically the child, when you ask them to take out the reader and open on page 8, some will dive down into their bags, pull out the reader, open on page 8 and be ready. Those are those last circles just before the flag that we saw earlier on. Some will just sit and stare at you. And then you'll have to repeat your instruction again. And even then, they don't always respond. And when you raise your voice like we do, because why aren't they responding? And you say, I said, the moment we raise some of them would pay more attention, but then they will still ask, and which page should we open? And that's the third or the fourth time you've repeated the same instructions. That creates a barrier to learning. It impacts on tempo of work. It will definitely impact on the overall performance within your classroom. Ting! There are so many different lack of impulse controls. We spoke about it briefly. So that's the child that finds it very difficult to wait. It's a child that when even the bell goes and it's break time, they would run for that door and push in everybody out of their way because they find it very difficult to wait their turn. They find it very difficult to just hold on a little bit. They need to do everything full speed. Ding! Tempo of work, as I said earlier on, if there's a problem with concentration, if there's a problem with muscle tone, if there's a problem with listening skills and with impulse control, tempo of work will be affected. For some children, they'll simply rush through their work, like they rush to get out the door, they rush through their work. And as we spoke about poor listening skills, those who take quite a long time, and it's the same with children who battle with ADD, that they take quite a while before they go over into action. So it looks like they procrastinate. So their tempo of work would be slow. So how on earth, teachers, you manage on a daily basis to navigate within the context of so much diversity? And that's not it. Ting, there's more. So if there's a problem with tempo of work, there's also a problem with task completion. So the slower the tempo of work, the slower the task completion. The quicker the tempo of work, the quicker the task completion, but to what quality or to what standard? So rushing through doesn't always mean a child has thought about what they're doing. They just rush to get the job done. And obviously, it impacts on the neatness and the quality of their work. And how is that a barrier to learning? Well, think of marking exam papers. What happens if you can't read through the writing? What happens if the sentence construction was poor? What happens if they didn't really think? Would they lose marks? Of course. So if there's a problem with tempo of work, there often is a problem with task completion, which impacts on marks in the end. Ting. Another barrier to learning is poor speech and language skills. I'm going to say this more than once because in the South African context, one of the greatest barriers to learning is language. You must always remember that a learner needs to conquer oral language before they are able to master written language. And if I say written language, I refer to writing and reading. So if a child has poor speech and language skills, it will transfer into their writing and reading, and obviously again in their performance as in overall. Ding! It's such a fun way of doing. Thank you, Chantal. Handwriting. So, as we just said, if there's a problem with speech and language, which is oral, it will transfer to written language, which then, as I said, refers to reading and to writing. So, when handwriting is poor, maybe because the child is rushing through their handwriting, maybe it's because their hands weren't developed properly, maybe they skip the crawling phase as a baby. Because you see, in our training as educators, very little attention was paid, if any attention at all, at the influence of early childhood development. Those first 1,000 days, that when a baby is crawling and they apply their body weight is pushed onto their hands and their knees, has an immense impact on their ability to sit, seating and positioning, the ability to sit straight and still and upright in a chair. But it also has a tremendous impact on the muscles in their hands. And I don't know if you know, but there are no muscles in the fingers. There are only ligaments in the fingers. The muscles of the hands are in the palms and the rest of the hand, not within the fingers. And while a baby is crawling on all fours, not bunny hopping, not bum hopping, not hanging in a walking ring, but crawling on hands and knees that wait on their hands, spread their fingers wide open. And then what happens is the thumb starts separating from the other four fingers. And when the thumb separates from the other four fingers, and if you look at your hand, if you separate your thumb from the other four fingers, you'll see it creates a capital letter L. And it's for language, because as the thumb separates from the other fingers, it coincides with the development, rapid development of the language centers of the brain. So can you see what happens on a physical level echoes on a mental level as well. Ping. So we spoke about, oh, now there's so many words because we can use the rest of the afternoon to just continue to build up this image. But if you look at the top, what appeared was reading. We spoke about that. Spelling at the bottom, and dyslexia as well. There's so many barriers to learning that it's sometimes very difficult to figure out, where will I start? Who do I refer to? Because if the each child in your class has a specific um, combination of barriers to learning, how do you address all of those barriers simultaneously in a classroom environment? And I'm going to attempt towards the end of the afternoon to focus on very specific neuroscience-based techniques that you can use practically in a classroom. And Chantal will later on share links with you and a Facebook page where you can find YouTube links to each of these tips that I will share with you towards the end. But for now, ping, when there are so many different barriers to learning, it is very difficult to know who do we refer to. Do we refer to an OT, to an optometrist, audiologist, play therapist, physio, speech therapist, psychologist, remedial therapist, dietitian? Who do we refer the child to? And as I think you've experienced in a classroom environment, nowadays money is scarce. So you may refer a learner, but where do we start? Because we can't refer to everybody simultaneously. But even if a parent is willing and they've got the means, the money to take a child to different therapists to help them to address the various barriers to learning, where do we start? Because we can't start with all of them at the same time. So ping, let's just quickly consider the impact of the diversity and the challenge level on you. So this is a picture about you suffering from anxiety. You're not suffering from phobias, I hope. Even sometimes post-traumatic stress due to the bullying that goes on in many schools where teachers are bullied. Teachers are bullied by parents, by colleagues, by the department. Sometimes they actually bully themselves because they do their utmost to do everything perfectly. There's a beautiful saying that says, perfectionism is the ultimate form of self-abuse. So it creates panic. It even creates feelings of shame. But do you know that this is not only true of the educator, this is also true of the children. They suffer tremendously from all kinds of phobias and fears. They suffer from stress and high levels of anxiety. Unfortunately, some of the parents too. Bing! So let's just for a moment think. Remember, I said earlier on, every assessment is a motor assessment. You cannot assess what a child doesn't do. It's an output. And the behaviors that we see, the attention deficit, the hyperactivity, the low muscle, it's all behaviors, but behavior is an output. You know, what we haven't spoken much about yet is a child's emotional behavior, because when a child experiences one or more barriers to learning, it often has a knock-on effect emotionally, and they may appear emotionally more immature than the rest of the learners in their classroom. So behavior is an output, and as you know, output is not the start of a process. There are two questions we need to ask yourself. Ping. The first question is the child able to process stimulation? In other words, when you give that child an instruction, when you ask them to take out the book, is the child able to process that stimulation? If they look at the blackboard, green board, whiteboard, fancy board, when they look at the board, when they look at a reader, are they able to process that stimulation? That's the first question. And that's the first thing we need to pay attention to when we get to our practical tips. The other question is the child grounded? Because if the child is not grounded, and I'll explain groundedness just now, if a child is not grounded, they would find it difficult to process any form of stimulation. And with that, sensory issues would come to the fore, which are all barriers to learning. Sensory integration issues would arise because if a child is not grounded, it means that they don't have a good relationship with gravity. Now, gravity, where does this fit into the equation? Well, I don't know how we got so far in education without understanding the fundamental relationship between the brain and gravity. So you see, gravity is our first mother. So gravity always pulls us towards the earth. And when a child feels solidly attached to the earth, and that's always because they can feel, they can sense their feet are solidly on the ground. And you see this, especially in foundation phase when learners draw themselves and they don't draw a grounding line. They draw themselves floating up in the air. And it's fascinating. You must watch when a learner draws a picture of themselves. They may be floating in the air, but when they draw other people, they draw them and there's a grounding line, or they draw them at the base of a paper, which indicates that they are standing on something. But when a learner draws a picture of themselves and there is no grounding line under their feet, it means that they're not aware of their feet firmly attached to gravity, to the floor, to the ground. Because when the feet are attached, when the brain knows where the feet are in relationship to the gravity, only then can the brain start helping the child to process information through these senses. We will talk about the senses just now. It's only when you know where your feet are that you feel emotionally safe, in control, and even confident. I know none of us have ever been drunk, but we have seen people who drank too much. And that was a sip of water. But have you noticed that when people are intoxicated, have you noticed how they walk? It's very clear that they don't know where their feet are. And that's why they're walking all over the show. Are you with me? So when the brain knows where the feet are, it's like current location. It helps the brain to navigate. And if I say navigate, it means that when the brain knows where the feet are, the brain knows where's down. And once the brain knows where's down, now you can figure out where's left and where's right, where's up, where's forward, where's backwards. Because if the brain doesn't know where you are, it can't figure out a timeline. It can't figure out time. If you think of numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, it has to start somewhere and then it goes on. If you think of the word cat, it's not random. There's a sequence. It starts in a specific place. Your brain can only jump to numbers and letters and time, days of the weeks, months of the year, formulas, memory, all of those amazing explanations are only possible if the brain knows where the feet are. We can talk about this for the rest of the afternoon, but let's progress. Bing! So let's quickly look at the brain of the average learner in your class. There are learners where the brain has been impacted on negatively. And so it's a structural problem. For example, if a child has experienced fetal alcohol syndrome, or they're diagnosed with fetal alcohol syndrome, their brain won't look like this. It would be smooth and it would be smaller. It still doesn't mean they can't learn, because the number of folds in your brain is an indication of how much the brain is learning, integrating, and expanding. So the less a brain is developed, the smoother it is. If you look at pictures of babies in utero, round about week 35, so it's 5 weeks before birth, the brain is much smoother than it is at full term delivery. So when we look at the brain like this, quick lesson in neuroscience. So you see the light blue line that stops at the base of the brain. Well, it actually runs all the way down the spine. So that's the spinal cord, and that's extremely important. And that funny bit that hangs out under the folds that looks like worms, that part of the brain is always an indication of where's the back part of the brain. So that's the back part of the brain. And then the front part is obviously close to the forehead. Okay, so just to orientate yourself, so to understand how learning takes place from a neuroscience perspective, let's look at the next slide. Ding! So information comes, the brain doesn't just know. The brain, as my colleague at our mind dynamics adult program at the Mindfulness Institute always says, the brain lives in the ultimate isolation chamber. And this is a bit a silly activity, but just for a moment, just knock on your own head and you'll feel, man, that skull is solid, it's thick. So how do you think information gets to the brain? It always enters the brain via the senses. But there's a fascinating thing, that's the green arrow. Now, okay, but the senses are in the eyes are up there. Why is the arrow down at the bottom of the brain? Because all information from your senses have to go through the spine before it can enter the brain. There's one exception, and that's smell, but we'll talk about that later on. So information comes into the brain right from the base of the brain. And the moment that information comes in, there's an immediate, without even the brain receives information before it perceives. We're going to show you where it's perceived, but it's later. It's way up in the brain. But the brain receives information, and the nature of that stimulation determines there's an emotional response that immediately says, this makes me feel safe, or this does not make me feel safe. So you cannot talk about learning, and we cannot talk about barriers to learning without talking about safety. So when the information comes in, and it's before the child has perceived what it means, there's an immediate response that says, this makes me feel safe. Then information would progress. And I'll show you the progression slide just now. But if information comes in and it doesn't smell right, it doesn't sound, it's too loud, it's just a strange sound in the strange time of day, maybe you're sleeping late at night and you hear breaking glass, that's, you won't even know it's breaking glass before you've responded on an emotional level, and you've recognized that I'm not safe, something is wrong. Bing. So let's assume for the moment that information, the information, the sensations that enter the senses went into the brain. The brain, there was an immediate sense of, this is okay, this is safe, I feel safe. I feel safe in the classroom. I feel I belong. My teacher likes me. There's a positive atmosphere in our class, conducive to learning. Then the information from the different senses go to the back part of the brain. So that funny looking map in green indicates the back part of the brain. Can you see the back part of the brain is much bigger than the front part of the brain? Then the back part of the brain is allocated to information from our senses. So different senses plug into different parts of the brain. So can you hear the importance of multisensory learning? Because if you only learn through talking, it only plugs into a small part of the brain. But when you talk and show, it plugs into a bigger part of the brain. If you create experiences where learners can move and touch and feel and see while you explain, it stimulates a bigger part of the brain, and the perception that is formed is of a much higher quality. Bing! So information is then processed. So sensory integration takes place, it's processed, and then can you see that arrow? It shows that it's pushed to the front part of the brain. Now, the front part of the brain is responsible for muscle movement. Remember, we said we can only assess output, we can only assess muscle movement. Speech is muscle movement, winking is muscle movement, clapping is muscle movement, jump, when I say jump, is muscle movement, writing, reading is all muscle movement, calculations, all muscle movement. You can't do a thing. You cannot be assessed unless a machine does the assessment. But as a human teacher, you can only assess output, and that always comes from the small front part of the brain. Bing! So when that information comes from the front part of the brain, can you see there's a second heart? Because again, information flows through the heart, and the heart says, am I sure about the answer? So I know, but am I sure enough that I'll be able to put up my hand and risk being wrong? So you see why feeling safe and secure is so incredibly important. Because when there's a hiccup with a sense of safety and security, it creates an immediate emotional barrier to learning. Bing! So the importance of creating a sense of safety and security. And ladies and gentlemen, educators, when you listen to this presentation or when you follow this presentation this afternoon, if there's only one thing that you take away from this afternoon, it is to work extremely hard at the atmosphere in your classroom. Oh my word, you may wonder, now where does she think I must find time to pay attention to the atmosphere in your class? Well, it determines whether learning is going to take place or not. That's really how it is. Because the moment learners feel unsafe, you lose them, because they start focusing, as the brain focuses on the needs of the physical body first. The second thing the brain focuses on is the child's emotional, or the learner's emotional need. And the first question that part of the brain asks is, are you feeling safe? And if the answer is yes, then they'll pay attention. But there's something else as well. And this is actually a session for another day. But it is, if a child cannot see the relevance of what you are teaching the child, they can't see what is in it for me. Why should I learn fractions? Because maybe one day you want to cut the pizza and you want to share them equal size slices with somebody. If we can't indicate relevance, we also very often lose attention. So it's not always a sensory issue. It's not always a neurological issue. Sometimes the issue with attention is the child, for the life of them, cannot see the relevance of what they're supposed to be learning. And it's the same with you this afternoon. If you find this presentation boring, if you find it irrelevant, you would lose attention and most probably disengage. It's natural human behavior. But attention is not the only thing affected by the child's sense of safety and security. Ping! Their motivation to learn is also affected by the emotional state and the sense of whether they perceive themselves to be safe or not. You know, that's why school uniforms been introduced many, many years ago, to create a sense of I belong. Because when we dress in a similar way, we create that sense of I belong. And that's why it's so difficult for a child who comes from another school that and they still come with their old school uniform and they stand out like a sore thumb. it's so difficult for them to concentrate, to pay attention, and to be motivated to learn, because their brain is constantly paying attention to, how do I fit in here? Who is anybody? Is there a threat in the environment? How do I belong? And as long as they don't feel that they belong, attention is compromised, and so is motivation. Bing. And so is memory, because the emotional part of the brain acts as both fuel that motivates and drives you, but it also acts as glue that sticks information in your memory. So if your heart is not in something, or if a learner's heart is not in something, they don't feel safe, or they can't see the relevance, or it's not important to them, it's difficult for them to remember. You know, it happens in class. When they've got it, they've got it. And then the next moment when you ask the same question, they've lost it. Why did they lose it? Well, there are many different reasons why they could have lost that information. It can be neurological in nature, that when the information was then transferred from short-term to long-term memory, the message got lost. But if the emotional response to what you're learning is strong enough and positive enough, it will automatically, the glue will be enough to stick it in memory. And then the last thing, if there's a problem, ping, if there's a problem with attention, motivation, and memory, there would automatically be a barrier to learning. So I hope this very brief lecture on neuroscience one-on-one, where information always comes from the senses, it enters the back brain as sensory raw data, which immediately creates an emotional response, first red heart, before it moves up to the back part of the brain where it's processed, pushed to the front part of the brain. And once the information makes sense, it's sent down to the second heart before it exits as output through that second arrow, which indicates muscle output in the form of speech, in the form of putting up your hand, in the form of nodding your head, writing, reading, or whatever it is that we require from a child. I hope that makes sense. So practical tips. So now you understand a little bit about the brain, and I think it's very easy for you to realize that there are many places where information can get lost. And if we want to unravel it seems like some children's minds are like their rooms. It looks a bit like a mess. We can't see inside it, but the output alludes to a messy inside in the mind as well. And if we want to unravel it and structure it and order it in a way that will lead to all the lights going on, because when we look at a child's eyes and you see there's light in a child's eyes, or their eyes are shining, this shine in eyes. That's if you don't have a headache, or if a person isn't ill or very tired. The light in children's eyes, or learners' eyes, everybody's eyes, is a reflection of the number of connections in the brain. So the more connections there are in the brain, the brighter the eyes. And I'm not talking about the color. I'm talking about light in their eyes. I think that's also what spurs us on as educators. When a learner is battling, but when you look at those eyes and you see those bright eyes, there's a bright brain in here. Somewhere, the electricity is getting muddled up. And that's why the learner is presenting with various barriers to learning. So practical class tips. Let's see, what can you do in your classroom to start addressing most barriers to learning. We can't address every single barrier to learning this afternoon. It's absolutely impossible. And we will not even be able to do that if we've got a week to talk for 8 hours a day to dress each and every one. But let's go for the most fundamental practical tips and things that you can do in your classroom that will assist the majority of the learner to benefit from your lesson. Bing. This slide should be up in every classroom, maybe be on the door. So we remind ourselves on a daily basis, and we remind our head of department, and around the principal and every teacher that comes into your classroom, even the Department of Education, that I don't care how much you know until I know how much you care. You see, that's the essence. That's the biggest takeaway from this afternoon. It doesn't matter how much you know. If the learners cannot sense how much you care, they will not learn in your classroom with great ease. There are learners who learn with ease that can learn in the presence of a dragon because they've got the ability to focus on what is relevant. They pay attention to what is relevant. They've got sufficient impulse control, and they've got sufficient confidence to use the information in a positive and a constructive way. But most learners and most human beings appreciate to sense that level of care. And can you see that that brain is not plugging into its own heart? It's plugging into somebody else's heart. So that is the learner's brain plugging into your heart. Because the moment they know you care, the moment they know you are interested in them as a person as well, where must you find time for all of this? It's in your attitude. It's not in time. It's in our attitude. The moment they sense you care, they start plugging in, and then barriers to learning may start being addressed. Bing. The second thing is language. In our country specifically, language is a huge problem. And if remember we said earlier on, verbal language precedes, or oral language precedes written language. Written language, both writing and reading. So irrespective of the learner's primary language, when a learner learns their primary language, their brains store essential linguistic rules needed to speak, write, and understand. The fundamental rules of grammar and syntax and all of that, and semantics, all of that is subconsciously stored. So it's as though they're creating capacity in the brain to process language when they learn their first language. And that's why decent language role models are so incredibly important. When you then want to learn in a second language, which is prevalent and true for most of the learners in our country, they learn in a second language, not in their primary language. Then the brain relies on those original rules and attempts to apply the original rules when learning a new language. And we call that language transfer. But again, you need a decent language role model. But can you see if there's a hiccup? And as you know, many learners cannot speak one language properly. And unfortunately, I know many learners have this most amazing, I don't know, mosaic of language, borrowing from each and every language that they are exposed to, but books aren't written in that kind of language. Test and exam papers aren't written in that mosaic kind of language. So it's vitally important that a learner learns one language properly and then apply those rules, language transfer, when they learn a second language. If a learner cannot listen to and understand the language of instruction in the classroom, and they'll have to learn to listen and understand, that takes a long time. It's called receptive language. That takes a long time before it moves across to the front brain in terms of expressive language. First speaking the language, and then we get to writing and reading. You know, in our country, that's not true for the majority of learners. Many learners learn to write and read a language that they can't speak yet, because it's not their primary language. So challenges, oh man, there are loads. But what is important for us to understand, that if you want to develop, if you want to address barriers to learning, you would find it extremely difficult to do that without language, without being able to speak a language that the learner in front of you can understand. How else are you going to understand where on our pyramid? Can you remember that mountain with the circles and that the flag right at the top? How will you even be able to gauge where they are on that journey if you're not they're not able to understand you and you are not able to understand them? So how do we address language difficulties in a classroom environment? Very simple. We teach them songs and rhymes in the language of instruction in class are vitally important to develop an ear for a language. Each language is like a radio station. You need to tune into the language. So the sound system of every language is different, and the ear needs to tune into it. Obviously, you can hear my English second language speaker. So my tongue, when I speak English, works in a very different way from when I speak my primary language, which is Afrikaans. The tongue movement, due to the sound system of Afrikaans, the tongue movement and the way your lips and your cheeks and your tongue interact is vastly different from when you speak English or isiZulu or any of the other languages in our country. So do you understand that when we teach songs, because we can move, there's fun and there's rhythm, and we explain the language on a concrete level, and then through repetition, build the vocabulary and the sensitivity to that language. Because when you sing a song, when you say a rhyme, when you do poems, when you read a story, obviously as well, but when the child is actively involved, like with songs and rhymes and poems, the child is developing the receptive language and expressive language simultaneously, and they adjust their language as they hear the other people pronouncing the language differently to the way they pronounce it. And then the tongue start moving and interacting with the cheeks and the lips in a different way to produce sound that is recognizable. Because if the child does not understand and speak the language of instruction, how do they feel included in that classroom? And you see, so you can create a marvelous atmosphere in your classroom, but if the child cannot speak, understand, or speak that language, despite the wonderful atmosphere, they still have a serious barrier to learning. Bing. The songs and rhymes are incredibly important. And as I said, Chantal will post all of this on the Mindmoose um, Facebook page later on, so you can follow the YouTube links. Because just due to the restriction of time, I'm not going to show you the videos, but you can look at this at a later stage. You remember when we spoke about the baby crawling and that hand stretching wide open and the separation of the thumb from the rest of the fingers? So this is what we mimic when we do the Mindmoose palm stretch. We just, as you are at the moment, use both your hands and just open up your hands as wide as you possibly can. Bend your fingers back as far as you possibly can. And then clench your fingers as tightly as you possibly can, because that movement is a physical, concrete movement, but it stimulates the language centers in the brain. So what will happen? It stimulates, it jumpstarts the language centers of the brain to overcome barriers to language, but also to handwriting. Because as you open the palm wide open and you hold it for a count of 8, and you clench your fingers tightly into a very tight fist, both hands simultaneously, to the count of 8, what you are doing is you are developing the muscles in the palms of the hand and the ligaments in the fingers to improve handwriting. So can you see, just before you do any form of oral lesson and just before you do any form of handwriting, this would be very, very handy if you can just use 2 minutes of your precious time to stimulate the hands and the brain to 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 enable speech and language and handwriting to improve. Bing. I find it very difficult not to be able to listen to your input and ask you questions. But for the sake of the webinar, let's just do this one directional communication. So we've spoken quite a bit about attention already, but I want you to understand that attention is something that happens in the brain. Okay, but this attention is allocated to where it's needed the most. So attention, it's like fuel, it's in a fuel tank. Attention is in the brain, but where the brain is going to apply that attention determines on the physical needs first, and then emotional needs, then social needs, and then finally only the cognitive learning needs. So are you with me? So if there's a hiccup, ping, if there's a hiccup on a physical level, so on the left-hand side, you'll see an image of a body, and you'll see the nerves inside the body that's connected to the brain up in the head. And now it's very easy. Chantal, can you just move your cursor down the spine, please? So can you see the spine? And then the nerves that run off the spine. But what we can't see is which nerves are running towards the spine and which nerves are running away from the spine. If you were in my classroom right now, I would have asked you, don't shout out, put up your hand if you know the answer. But when the information that runs towards the brain, the sensors need to catch that information and then send it towards the spine and then up to the brain. And you know by now that then information goes to the back part of the brain. And if those sensations are positive and the child feels safe, it will progress to the higher parts of the brain. Thank you, Chantal. And then to the front part of the brain before the front part sends the message back to the spine and then to the muscles all over the body for the child to be able to respond. So if the nervous system is working optimally, a child's response is very quick. If you just think of a baby, if you've ever seen a baby around about 8 to 12 months old baby, because they can wave goodbye. They can normally clap hands as well if they've been exposed to it. But you know, parents are so proud of their little ones when they start showing output, when they start moving in a recognizable way, like clapping hands or waving, or obviously saying mama, dada, that kind of thing as well, which are all muscular movements. But you know how people sometimes invite guests so they can leave and then they can show off because the baby can wave goodbye. And then when they leave, and they say to the baby, say goodbye, and they sit. Say goodbye, say tata. Oh, nothing. Say tata. And then the tonality keeps on going up. And then people feel embarrassed and they drive off. And as they turn the corner, out comes the little hand and it waves. So with a young child, and whenever we learn something new, there's always, and that's why it's so difficult to teach and learn something new, because you need to create new pathways in the body and the brain. And it's when that's done in a safe environment, the quality of that pathway is quickly much better. The quality increases if it's delivered in a multi-sensory using many senses, and if it's delivered in a way where a learner feels safe and secure. But repetition is important for that new learning. All learning is wired in the brain. And those wires need to strengthen. And then those wires need to insulate, you know, like cover on an electrical cord. It insulates in the brain and in the body before a child is able to perform something. So sometimes we teach something once and we expect, and we told them, we only told them, we didn't even tell and show, or maybe we told and show, but they didn't have an experience. And now I've taught you, so now you should know that no, my darling, it's going to take you the best part of 10,000 repetitions or such a massively interesting lesson where the child is really engaged and you're utilizing multisensory modalities, touch, maybe even smell and taste as well, hearing and sight and movement because it's a sensory modality. Then the quality of that learning is of such a nature that you don't need 1,000 repetitions anymore. You need way less. And that's why, irrespective of age, whether a child is preschool, foundation phase, intermediate, senior phase, it doesn't matter, an adult. When we learn in a multi-dimensional way, it's always easier to learn. So when the nervous system in the body works well, as we said earlier on, it can only work optimally, and that's hence the picture, ping, of the feet right at the bottom. Can you remember earlier on? Next slide, ping. So there are gravitational receptors, gravity. Remember, that's our first relationship, is not with our biological mother or our care mother, it's with gravity. And there are receptors under your feet that the brain needs to know where your feet are before your brain can organize anything, before the brain knows where you are, like current occasion, or in which direction are you facing and what comes next. So praxis or all kinds of movement activities, all thinking has a sequence to it. And if the brain doesn't know where the feet are, it's incredibly difficult for the brain to act on anything. So what can you do in a classroom? Obviously, it would be wonderful if we could do feet massage on a daily basis. Well, typically in winter, not in summer, because then they're too sweaty. Joke. Ping. But what you can do in a classroom on a daily basis is whenever a learner walks into the classroom, ask them to walk on their heels. Because the moment they walk on their heels, the brain recognizes that there's something going on down there, and the feet plug into the brain via the vestibular system, and that enables the brain to process um, the direct, where are you and in which direction are you moving, before it can process the direction of speech, the direction of numbers, of sounds, of days of the week, and all of that kind of stuff. Ping. But you can also ask them to walk on their toes. So sometimes let them walk on their heels when they walk into the classroom. Because there's another thing about heel walking, is the moment that one feels anxious, your calf muscles automatically pull up. And that's why you'll often see children who are hyperactive tend to walk on their toes. They're not necessarily pretending to be walking on high heels. Sometimes they play a game and they pretend to walk on high heels, and then the heels are raised. But if a child is battling with concentration and attention, you'll often find, especially if they're hyperactive, you'll often find that they raise their heels. Watch when children write tests and exams. When they feel anxious, what happens? They raise their heels. In the moment the calf muscles contract, it automatically raises the heels, and it pulls attention from the clever part of the brain to the survival part of the brain. So heel walking is incredibly important, but just for variety and to improve balance, because as you improve balance, you actually improve the functioning of the vestibular system, which is responsible for sensory integration and for muscle tone. So ping, there's another way of walking. Now you can start jumping, you can skip, you can gallop into the classroom. And if you see learners are losing concentration, let them, they don't have to walk out of the classroom and walk back in. Let them just jump up and down, jump to the left, jump to the right, jump forward, jump backwards, hop on one leg, then on the other leg. It will immediately, it will create chaos, okay? Just for a short period of time. It will release an enormous amount of energy, and then open the door so the energy can leave. And then they sit down again, and you will notice that they will be able to concentrate. So much better. So what have we said so far in terms of practical tips? Number one, your attitude. And that attitude of, in my classroom, I'm going to create a space of safety and security where whenever the child wants, am I safe? The answer must always be yes. Yes, I am safe here. Yes, I belong here. Yes, my teacher will make sure that I'm not bullied. My teacher is looking out for me. And that's also why children's behavior change. Teachers sometimes comment on a child's behavior in their class, but that same child does not behave like that in your class. And not always, but sometimes the reason for that is the atmosphere in the classroom. We said language is incredibly important. If they don't understand the language of instruction in classroom, I wonder why we're trying to teach them to write and read. It's child abuse on one level, because if they were capable of doing that, they would. So they don't because they can't. And then to improve concentration and release the anxiety and that sense of overwhelm that sometimes occurs, especially if they're learning something new and they're not quite getting it, is to plug those feet into gravity, and then it would make it much easier for the child. They'll calm down, they'll sit down when they're done, focus and concentrate, and then learning will become a little bit easier. You can also use weighted bean bags, and people do that in many different ways. If you've got ankle weights, especially for a child that really battles to sit still, ankle weights are excellent. Some people prefer to put like a bean bag on the shoulders, or two bean bags, one on each, so the child doesn't go all skew, but they sit up straight. The problem is if the child is battling to sit straight and still, and they start moving and the beanbags fall down, all the attention will go to the beanbags, and they will draw the attention of the other children around them. So obviously big enough beanbags that they can hang across the shoulder, but heavy, because that pushing down towards gravity gives them a sense of safety and security. You can do the same thing on their lap, to just push them down into the chair, because that helps them to it helps the brain to get a sense of current location. Weights around the ankles are excellent, because it weighs the legs, well, it weighs feet down actually. So and then the child can sense their feet. And what did we say? Then the brain just plays so much easier. Bing! Another thing that we can do and that we will be sharing with you is the mindfulness massage. Yes, I can share a photo that a school in Bloemfontein sent to us today, where they do this with their learners, do this with each other. And obviously it takes some time for them, and ideally the teacher that does movement, that teacher will have more time in that class to teach these movements, but it's an investment in time that will give you a massive return on investment over a period of time, when learners learn to trace each other's outline and then plant the feet. So but it's also a movement that once you've got the link, that you can share with the parents of your learners, because they need to do this at home. You can't do this with all the learners, but they've got one or two children at home. They can do that in the morning before the child comes to school. Maybe there's not time. Then they can do it in the evenings before the child goes to sleep, because then they'll sleep better and wake up with in a more positive frame of mind, more ready to learn. So it's marvelous. I can tell you loads of stories about this. Ping, and the next move, can you see how they planted the feet in the previous picture? And now, because the arms are wide open, you take a breath in and you breathe out, you exhale as you give yourself a hug. Why would this be helpful? In the beginning of every single day, after break, after a difficult situation in class, we can, without doing the mindfulness massage, you can just, as you are right now, just sit up because that's always important, because the spine is the elevator shaft to the brain. So if your spine is if you are slouching, it means it's more difficult for information to get to and from the brain. That's why posture is so incredibly important. So when you open your arms as wide as possible, then breathe out, give yourself a hug. And what would you be fostering? I feel safe and secure. My heart is at ease, so information can progress all the way to the brain. Bing. What else can we do? Oh, sensory processing. So, as I actually spoke about this already when I said, when we teach in a multisensory way, this is just a beautiful graphic, but you'll see it's only the senses that tell us something about what's happening in our environment. Touch, the hand at the top, smell and taste is telling us about the environment. The ear is telling us about what are you hearing from the outside. The eye, what am I seeing? So it's called the outside senses, but we also have inside senses. Proprioception, the vestibular system, and kinesis, which are the senses that help us to link what is happening on the outside to where my body is and what my body is capable of, and only then can a child go over into action. So sensory processing is incredibly important, and the more senses we engage when we teach something new, using food, using something concrete, always process and speeds up all kinds of sensory processing. It makes it's more fun. Learners engage attention because it's fun. So what happens? Can you remember the blue slides with the heart and the attention and the motivation and the memory and learning? So it all starts with sensory processing. And what is fascinating, and maybe we can talk about that another time, is that all information comes in as vibration, and the senses need to convert it into electrical impulses. It's a miracle. Every time a learner responds to what we've just said, you've experienced a miracle. We do not respect the difficulty, the complexity of our sensory system, and that's why so many learners have sensory issues, because their senses are battling to convert vibrational stimulation into electrical impulses. Ping. There's a ping. So there are two mind moves that I'm not even going to discuss. The YouTube clips are very, very clear. The previous one is about, just go back one. The neck flexor is you push to improve posture. So sensory information can flow better to the brain and exit the brain as well towards the muscles. And simultaneously, it helps the vestibular system to navigate sensory integration and muscle tone. Marvelous, marvelous mind move. The next one, which is called ping, which is the mouse pad, is a visual exercise. So it's a visual, it's neuroscience in motion. And these are very simple physical exercises and activities that you can do in your classroom to just jumpstart. If you look at the mouse pad, it's obviously a visual movement. So if a learner is predominantly kinesthetic or auditory, well, to write and read, you have to be visual. So learning style is all fine, but life is not going to cater for a child's learning style. Ultimately, all learners need to be visual as well. So it's a movement that stimulates our visual ability, and it integrates visual, auditory, and kinesthetic simultaneously. Ping! It's nearly time to go home. So remember, earlier on we said behavior is an output. And obviously, we want a learner to behave in a way that says, you got this. You know, they've got what we just taught them. But if a learner's behavior is atypical, it always reminds me of a learner who said to Sally Goddard, who's at the Institute for Neurodevelopmental Delays in Chester in the UK. she told the story of a learner who was 12 years old, who really battled with barriers to learning for many, many years. And when she was 12, she overcame most of the barriers. And then she made a comment to her mom, and she said, why couldn't you see that the way I was telling you what I couldn't say? So what is she saying? She's saying, Mom, please look at behavior. Look at people's behavior are actually talking to you, and they are telling you, they are crying out for help. Please help me. So is the child grounded? We spoke about that often enough, and we said jumping, walking on heels, walking on tiptoes, and things like that. So our presentation was aimed at answering these two, two, two points. How to enable a child to process stimulation, sensory stimulation, and how to ground a child, and how to create that positive, safe environment in your classroom to enable a learner to learn with great ease. Bing. So educators, we're at the end of our session, and obviously we just touched on such a vast field this afternoon. But these very, very simple activities are really, really practical tips that we've experimented with at the Manghus Institute for years, and we find them incredibly helpful. So you may please be free to share them with whoever you want to share them with, and let's create a learning revolution where we share practical things that enable learners to learn in our classrooms, but also share them with the parents. So parents can assist, because especially think back of that image of the hill and that route up towards that flag, which is academic success or mastering a specific lesson. So some learners are so far away from that flag, they need they need therapy, they need additional intervention, but they definitely need the ongoing support of their parents doing practical things with them at home to speed up the number of repetitions that will mature the nervous system, that will enable them to learn with greater ease, enable them to learn the language of instruction, speak the language of instruction within the safety of a classroom environment, feeling that they belong, and then to experience academic success. Thank you for dedicating your lives, your time, your energy, your health to the benefit of other people's children. I salute you. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Dr. Diaga. It's always such a informative session when we have you around, and we always feel like you must give us 5 hours, but unfortunately, there's never really enough time. But we know that you are always dedicated to come and share your knowledge with us, and we thank you so much. Seeing that we still have a few minutes, 7 more minutes, would you be willing to take a few questions?
Of course.
Okay, thank you so much. Just in our chat, there's someone that just asked, Vanessa asked that I ask you to speak about soft and hard ears. I don't think I understand the question, but perhaps you would know.
Okay, Vanessa, soft and hard ears. Very good question. Okay, Chantal, would you please just share that soft and hard post that you did on Facebook this week? Won't you just share it with the people when you do? Oh, I don't know if you'll be able to access it so quickly. But if you can, otherwise Chantal will mail it to you, because I've been noticing that you're sending in emails. So the thing is, you must remember, sound enters the brain via the ears, but not the ears only. Sound enters the brain via air and via bone conduction. Okay, so the ear lobes are incredibly important, because the quality of the ear lobes determine to a great extent the quality of the sound that ultimately gets to the brain. I'm going to say that again. The quality of the ear lobes determines the quality of the sound that ultimately gets to the brain. So if a learner's ear or your own earlobes are very hard, your earlobes, hard earlobes amplify sound. Hard earlobes amplify sound. So those learners that often block their ears because they say it's too noisy in a classroom, they say it's too noisy because the ears are, maybe the classroom is noisy, but in all probability, if just a few children comment on it, it may be because their hard earlobes amplified the sound to a very uncomfortable level. It's very interesting. As we grow older, the earlobes actually become harder because we lose some of the hair on the inside of the ear that conducts the sound. And those hairs are involved in converting the sound vibration from the eardrum into electrical impulses. So that's why older people have such big ears and tend to have very hard ears. So the opposite of that is when a learner's earlobes are very soft, and you actually see it when some learners play with their earlobes because they're so soft, they fold them up and push them in the little hole of their ears. So, um, if a hard ear amplifies sound, what would a soft ear do? It minimizes sound. So soft ears mean a learner, the quality of the sound that enters the brain is very soft, and sometimes too soft to pay attention to. And that's why the child asks you for information to be repeated. And sometimes just they need a lot of repetition because they need to amplify. And we didn't include that mind move in the session this afternoon, but that's why we have a movement called the antenna adjuster, where you use your fingers and thumbs to massage the earlobes. Or you can massage the children, the learners' earlobes, but they can do it themselves as well. You can demonstrate. Magical, because they use their hands, which are associated with language expression, both verbal and in written form, and to massage the ears, which are involved with the reception of language. So when you massage the ears from top to bottom, it's fascinating. You'll see when you do it with a group of children, you'll see the ears turn red. Why? Because there's better blood flow. The nervous system has been stimulated. So there's better awareness in the ears. So the same movement will soften a hard ear and strengthen a soft ear. Thanks for your question.
Thank you so much, Dear. I think we just have 2 more minutes. I think we'll take one more. Is there any other person that has another question? Because we've answered all the ones in the chat.
Michelle,
Yes.
Mr. Lepeli has a question, and he asks, the hand stimulation exercise, the palm stretch, is it encouraged to be done by learners maybe before the start of a lesson?
Not if you want them to listen. It's a good question, sir. You see, it depends on the nature of the lesson. If you want them to listen first, I wouldn't do the hand massage because it will stimulate the hands represent expressive language. Okay, so when we talk, we use our hands. When we write, we use our hands. So if the nature of the lesson, say they need to do a presentation, an oral presentation, marvelous. But if you want them to listen and to observe first, I would rather stimulate their eyes and the ears so they receive better. And then when it's that time during the lesson when they need to start talking or writing, then it would be an appropriate time to open and stretch the hands and then to clench the fists. And we just do that 3 times, less than a minute, because it's 8 seconds per position. So it's 6 times 8, and 6 times 8 is 48. So it's less than a minute to do all of them, to do 3 repetitions of the palm stretch. But it's aimed predominantly at language expression, both in a verbal and a written form. Thank you very, very much, NAPTOSA, for another wonderful opportunity to do community service. I really appreciate the opportunity, and thanks for the delegates that participated so superbly this afternoon. Really appreciate that. Need to thank Chantal, my remote navigator of the ping, the receiver of the pings this afternoon. Appreciate your help, Chantal. Please go well.
Okay, thank you, and we appreciate you. Thank you to everyone that joined us. Please be on the lookout for more of our sessions. And thank you again, Dr. Diaga. Thank you, Chantal. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.